In the grand courtyard of Winterfell, the chill wind swept across the cobblestones, carrying with it the scent of pine from the forests beyond the walls. Bran Stark, third son of Lord Eddard Stark, lingered near the archery butts, fidgeting with the fletching of an arrow. He was slender, only a few weeks beyond his 7th name day, and filled with the boundless energy of a child who had already caught glimpses of the world's possibilities. He adjusted the grip on his bow and aimed with a precision that belied his young age. At that moment, the sound of distant laughter drew his attention toward the walls of Winterfell's formidable keep. His siblings were scattered around the courtyard, each pursuing their own amusements and duties, but Bran felt an itch of curiosity tug at him. He had half a mind to go climbing the way he loved best, scuttling up ledges and footholds like a squirrel. Yet something in him hesitated. His mother's recent warnings still echoed, "Bran, if you must climb, take care. There are safer places." He let the arrow fly, watching it sink into the target, just a hair away from the bullseye. Satisfaction briefly replaced his curiosity, but that stir of restlessness remained. He set the bow aside and strode across the courtyard in search of a new distraction. Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell, was sparring with a wooden sword on the far side of the yard, practicing his footwork as he'd been taught by Ser Roderick Castle. Jon Snow watched with keen interest, a ghost of a smile on his lips. Even at that young age, the differences in their station were a quiet undercurrent. Robb, the trueborn, and Jon, the bastard, but it never stood between their camaraderie. Their laughter momentarily burst over the clack of wooden swords, and Bran couldn't help but grin at the sight. Nearby, Theon Greyjoy, ward of Lord Stark, lounged against a pillar with a cocky grin, calling out unhelpful jabs at Robb about his stance. Sansa and Arya, for the moment, were nowhere to be seen, and Rickon was probably with old Nan, hearing tales of knights and monsters. Bran's heart quickened. Across the courtyard, Hodder trudged past, carrying a sack of feed. He gave Bran a friendly nod. Before the stable's wide doors, a servant rushed by with a basket of linens. Life went on in Winterfell's steady rhythm. Yet young Bran couldn't shake off his restlessness. The outside world beckoned like an unexplored forest. Often, he indulged that yearning for heights and vantage points, scaling the walls and rooftops to look out over the domain his father ruled. If truth be told, he wanted to see all the wonders of Westeros someday. The Titan of Bravos, the cities of the free folk, the sunset sea that lay west of them all. But for now, Winterfell's towers were his entire world, and he would climb them as though they were mountains. Though his mother's warnings were urgent, the call of exploration was stronger. He could see that certain window high in the first keep, the very spot he'd climbed to many times before. That place offered a secret vantage from which he could watch everything. The men on the ramparts, the bustle in the courtyard, and beyond the walls, the stables, the glass gardens, and the endless forests. He took 2 steps forward before remembering that Catelyn Stark had said she would be calling for him soon. A letter from King's Landing had arrived, and it would likely bring news of some upcoming visits. In that moment of internal debate, should he obey or should he climb? His better judgment won out. Bran turned away from the tower. If only for once, he would heed his mother's wishes not to roam the rooftops unsupervised. By dusk, a hush had fallen over the keep. The wind carried an icy edge that promised an early winter's approach. Bran found himself in the great hall, seated next to Rickon, who was half asleep beside him. Before them, Lord Eddard Stark and Lady Catelyn received their household's reports. The great hall's torches cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the voices of various stewards and guards mingled softly in the high vaulted space. Many matters needed tending: grain stores, border patrols, and the comings and goings of lords sworn to Winterfell. Bran's mind wandered, though. He thought about how that same great hall would soon host the king, if the rumors were true that Robert Baratheon planned a journey north. Catelyn had read the letter to Ned in private, but the entire household buzzed with speculation. Would the king bring all his retinue? Would the queen come as well? Would the royal children be present? When the night ended, Bran returned to his small chamber that overlooked the courtyard. His limbs itched with the desire to move, but sleep called louder. He slid into the familiar warmth of his bed, though his thoughts kept him awake longer than usual. He pictured the tall tower windows and the sense of freedom they offered. If he closed his eyes, he could almost feel the rough stone beneath his hands, the wind in his hair, the world shrinking beneath him as he climbed. In the weeks that followed, as word of King Robert's imminent arrival solidified into certainty, Winterfell became a hive of preparation. Bran found himself with less time for climbing or archery, as Maester Luwin insisted upon more lessons. Young as he was, even he understood that the North's hospitality must be impeccable for a visiting king. Catelyn had new dresses made for Sansa and Arya, fussing over stitching and fabrics. Ned instructed Robb and Jon on the decorum expected of them in front of their guests. Even Theon Greyjoy seemed busier than usual, delivering messages, checking supplies, standing by Robb's side when some matter of the king's visit needed an extra set of hands. When the king finally arrived, his procession filled the courtyard, spilling out beyond the gates to the open fields. Horses snorted and stomped, wagons rattled, and the flash of gold and steel dazzled young Bran's eyes. Far more knights than he'd ever seen in one place were suddenly milling around Winterfell's yard. The king himself, a large man with a thick black beard beginning to show threads of gray, dismounted with a grunt and embraced Lord Eddard as an old friend. Queen Cersei, regal in her bearing and cold in her gaze, scanned the assembled Starks with polite disinterest. Prince Joffrey, pale-haired and sharp-eyed, walked with an arrogance that seemed beyond his years. Beside him came Princess Myrcella and Prince Tommen, each with their own retinue. Bran's heart hammered as he bowed low with his siblings, mindful of proper courtesy. What a grand event this was! What a swirl of new faces and new possibilities! He could barely contain his excitement. Over the next few days, feasting and revelry took over Winterfell. Bran observed everything with rapt attention, especially the king's knights, whose armor shone under torchlight, their swords at their hips. There was jousting in the courtyard, mock duels for the king's entertainment, and hunts that set out at dawn. Arya darted around, tangling herself in escapades with the butcher's boy, Micah, and occasionally crossing Sansa's more refined path, sowing little bits of chaos. Sansa, meanwhile, was all grace and courtesy, eager to impress the queen and especially Prince Joffrey. Bran found himself often near the center of events, not because he was needed, but because he wanted to watch. He had rarely seen so many Southerners before. Their bright colors, their manners, their songs and stories. All of it seemed a world away from the stark dignity of the North. On a bright, cold morning, the king decided on a boar hunt in the nearby forests. Ned Stark, of course, would accompany him, and he invited Robb to join, along with several lords and knights. Bran stood by the gates, shifting on his feet, wishing he could ride out as well. But his father had told him he was still too young to join such a dangerous hunt. Instead, Bran found himself in the courtyard, practicing with his bow once more. He tried not to let envy color his mood, though it crept in occasionally. That was the day, as fate would have it, that nearly changed everything. After the hunting party had departed, Winterfell settled into a hush. Only a handful of guests remained behind. The queen, her children, and a few household knights. Catelyn had retreated to her solar to oversee some matters of state, while Sansa and Arya were occupied indoors with their own pursuits. Bran found himself alone with a drifting sense of restlessness again. He picked up his wooden practice sword, half-heartedly swung it at a post, then grew bored. His gaze wandered upward, to the high tower. The stone called to him, reminding him that he was free to climb if he wished. Yet he remembered his mother's voice, the seriousness in her eyes. He looked away. Instead, he discovered that Tyrion Lannister, the queen's dwarf brother, had lingered in the courtyard. Tyrion was flipping through pages of a small book as he walked. Perhaps it was curiosity, or the simple novelty of a man so different from those Bran knew, that drew Bran near. He approached politely as he had been taught. Tyrion glanced up from his reading, offered a small smile, and greeted the boy. Bran asked him a series of questions, about books, about King's Landing, about the creatures Tyrion had seen on his travels. "Your curiosity is commendable, my young lord," Tyrion said, snapping the book shut. "Might I ask, do you spend much time climbing these walls, as I've heard from your father?" Bran nodded, a hint of pride in his smile. "I love to climb, my lord. From the top of the towers, I can see all of Winterfell and sometimes beyond." Tyrion's eyes flicked upward, to the tower that Bran had often scaled. A look of fleeting sadness crossed his face, or perhaps wistfulness. Ah, to see the world from that height. Even from the vantage of a castle wall, the realm must appear different. "The wide north, your father's domain. There's a certain freedom in that, isn't there?" Bran agreed, but he also told Tyrion how his mother disapproved, how she feared for his safety. Tyrion listened with an understanding nod, as if he knew better than most how it felt to be seen as fragile or limited. "Well," he said gently, "mothers worry, but do be careful, young lord. The world needs sharp eyes, though it also needs working legs and arms." After that day, Bran still felt the temptation to climb, but his mother's repeated lectures and a new sense of caution, perhaps fueled by Tyrion's gentle warning, kept him grounded. He practiced archery more diligently, listened more closely in his lessons, and occasionally found himself reading small bits of history by Maester Luwin's prompting. He was still just a boy, but in small steps, he was beginning to imagine himself as someone who might one day be of greater use to House Stark, beyond just climbing like a squirrel. Events continued to unfold as if guided by threads of fate. The king named Eddard Stark the new hand of the king, much to Ned's own reluctance. He accepted, bound by honor and duty. In short order, he prepared to journey south to King's Landing, taking Sansa and Arya with him. Robb would remain behind to hold Winterfell in his father's stead. Catelyn would likely stay behind as well, to oversee the rest of the household. A part of Bran wished he could go to King's Landing too, to see the castle of the Red Keep, the city of a million souls, the Dragon Pit, and the endless sprawl of shops and taverns. Yet he would remain in Winterfell. Ned told him that perhaps another day, when he was older, there would be time to see the South. Winter would last many years, and he would have to stay near his mother until the realm was at peace. Still, a seed of disappointment took root in Bran. He watched as wagons were loaded, horses made ready, and the king's party prepared to depart alongside Lord Stark. Sansa walked with a demure excitement, dreaming of courtly life. Arya bounced on her toes, trying to appear less thrilled than she clearly was, but betraying it whenever her father wasn't looking. Bran tried to be dutiful. He tried to accept that this was the way of things. Another boy might have sulked, but Bran couldn't forget the opportunity. He was so close to all of those wonders, yet would remain behind. He consoled himself by promising he would climb again, once everything quieted down, just to see the horizon from Winterfell's highest tower. When the king's party and Ned Stark departed, accompanied by Sansa, Arya, and a retinue of guards and servants, Winterfell's courtyard felt strangely empty. Robb stood tall, watching them ride off, and Bran could see a flicker of responsibility gleaming in his older brother's eyes. Robb was no longer simply the oldest brother. For a time, he was Lord of Winterfell, caretaker of the North in their father's absence. Bran sensed that change in the air. Perhaps, in time, he would step into his own role. One day, after the commotion had settled, Catelyn finally relented. Bran had completed all of his lessons, and he had shown caution about climbing. She let him wander about the castle with fewer restrictions, trusting or perhaps hoping that he would not scale the walls unsupervised. But the temptation was there always. One late afternoon, as the sun spilled gold across Winterfell's stone towers, Bran decided to climb again, just for a short time. The holdfast's outer walls beckoned like old friends. Carefully, as he'd done many times in the past, he slipped into a narrow walkway and found a foothold on the rough gray stones. He moved with a practiced grace, letting his small hands find purchase, trusting in the reliability of each ledge. Higher and higher he climbed, the wind tugging at his hair, his heart pounding with the quiet thrill of a secret adventure. At the top, instead of eavesdropping on anyone's conversation or glimpsing something he shouldn't, Bran simply perched on a ledge and looked out over the courtyard, the godswood, and the farmland stretching beyond the walls. The sun was setting in a blaze of pink and orange, painting the sky in colors that seemed to carry stories of distant horizons. He felt at peace in that moment, a prince in his own private kingdom of stone ramparts and swirling breezes. For once, he thought, there was no looming dread, no voice in his ear urging caution. He had chosen this for himself, and it felt good. The weeks passed into months, and Ned Stark's letters from King's Landing brought news of political intrigues that Bran barely understood. Something about the Lannisters, about debts owed to the crown, about the king's spendthrift nature. Bran heard rumors from passing lords and courtiers, but much of it went over his head. He was more interested in the comings and goings of life in Winterfell. Robb began to oversee smaller matters of justice. Maester Luwin guided him, while Theon Greyjoy stood at his side, smirking. Catelyn grew anxious, often retreating to the godswood to pray. From her occasional absences, and the set of her jaw when she read Ned's letters, Bran guessed that matters in the south were far from peaceful. There came a day when riders arrived from the road, bearing grim expressions. They brought news that Lord Eddard Stark had uncovered unsettling truths in King's Landing, and that tension with the Lannisters had soared. Bran only gleaned fragments. Rumors that Prince Joffrey was not truly the son of King Robert, that the Queen had conspired with her brother, Ser Jaime Lannister, to keep the royal lineage a secret. The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit in Bran's young mind, but he knew something big was happening. Across the north, bannermen were stirring. Robb began to talk about calling them to Winterfell for defense. Theon gave sly hints of war. One crisp morning, Catelyn Stark announced that she would journey south on urgent business. She believed that she might help Ned, or at least gain some answers about the strange circumstances that had arisen. She took Ser Roderick Castle with her, leaving Robb behind to hold Winterfell. If such a step had once been unthinkable, it was now necessary. The kingdom stood on the brink of chaos. Bran watched from the walls as his mother's carriage rolled out the gates. His heart clenched. He was still just a child, yet he felt the weight of uncertain times pressing on him. Winterfell under Robb's leadership did not become chaotic, though. There was a sense of calm, but also of growing tension. Robb wore his responsibilities like a new cloak, adjusting day by day. He summoned the Lords of the North to discuss matters of loyalty and strategy. Young as he was, the blood of the Starks ran strong in him, and people listened. Bran found himself sometimes sitting with Robb in the Great Hall, quietly observing the way bannermen spoke of war and alliances. Names like Bolton, Umber, and Manderley came up. They pledged fealty to House Stark, but each had concerns and demands of their own. A fortnight later, ravens arrived bearing dreadful tidings. King Robert was dead, Ned Stark was arrested for treason, and Joffrey Baratheon now claimed the Iron Throne. Bran's world turned upside down. How could his father be a traitor? Ned Stark was the embodiment of honor. The shock rippled through Winterfell. Robb's face hardened, and Theon muttered about Lannister treachery. Maester Luwin wasted no time dispatching ravens of his own, presumably calling the bannermen to readiness for war. The North would not stand idle when its warden was in chains. Even in his youth, Bran understood that bloodshed was looming. The great Jon Umber arrived first, followed by the Karstarks, the Mormonts, and others. They filled the castle with their armed retinues, turning Winterfell from a peaceful keep into a bustling military camp. Robb, barely older than 16, was expected to lead them. Each passing day, the chatter of war grew louder, the stench of horse and steel thickened in the air, and Bran found himself both exhilarated and terrified. If only his father's innocence could be proven without swords. But that was not the way of the realm, it seemed. On a dim morning that smelled of wood smoke and autumn leaves, Robb marshaled his forces. Bran stood on the battlements, watching as thousands of men formed up in the courtyard and beyond, ready to march south. The once quiet ramparts were alive with the clang of armor and the low hum of anxious men. Robb, astride a large warhorse, glanced up at Bran and raised a hand. In that moment he looked older than his years. Theon Greyjoy was beside him, wearing a confident grin. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, prowled at the edge of the gathering, restless and silent. With Robb's departure, Winterfell was left guarded but emptier than ever. Maester Luwin offered to let Bran sit in on matters of state that still needed handling. The boy accepted, needing to fill his days and sense of purpose. He spent hours in the Maester's turret, learning about ravens and the messages they carried. He discovered how the ravens had codes they recognized, how to tie tiny parchment notes to their legs. He read letters from various northern houses, some containing updates from the southern battlefields, though the language was often veiled. He caught glimpses of the stark truth. The North was at war with the Crown. One day, as the autumn sunlight slanted through the narrow windows, Bran read a letter addressed to the Lord of Winterfell. It spoke of the Riverlands burning under Tywin Lannister's army, of battles near the Twins, and the uncertain alliance with Walder Frey. None of it was truly for him to read, but Maester Luwin did not stop him. Perhaps, in his own way, the Maester believed that knowledge would prepare Bran for what was to come. The horrors of war were laid bare. Villages razed, families scattered, armies marching. This was not some grand story told by old Nan about knights in shining armor. It was real and grim. A chill set in the following weeks, and the days grew shorter. Still no word of Ned's release. Instead, the Raven messages grew ever darker. Rumors that King Joffrey had executed Ned Stark for treason reached Winterfell with the swiftness of a hammer blow. They arrived through second-hand sources, an outrider from the Neck, a traveling merchant from White Harbor, whispering that Lord Eddard Stark had been beheaded in front of the Great September of Baelor. No Raven from King's Landing confirmed it officially, but the stories were too consistent to dismiss. When Maester Luwin finally read the fateful letter with the royal seal, he blanched and carried the message to Bran personally. Bran felt as if the entire world had stopped. In that moment, had he not been sitting in a chair, he might have collapsed. He could barely register the words as Maester Luwin tried to soften the blow. His father, dead? How could that be? He felt anger and sorrow crash over him in waves. He remembered the last time he saw Ned in the courtyard, firm but kind, his voice full of fatherly guidance. He recalled the final evening meal, where Ned had ruffled his hair and told him to stay safe. That was gone now, stolen away by a boy king's cruelty. The desire for vengeance burned bright in Bran, but it was tempered by a child's sense of helplessness. Robb was out there, leading an army, fighting for their father's honor, and he hadn't been in time. Catelyn eventually returned to Winterfell, her eyes hollow, her face etched with grief. She embraced Bran, Rickon, and Sansa and Arya, who had been sent north at some point after escapes and negotiations, though the details were muddled and not well known to Bran. The grief became a silent companion in Winterfell's halls. The statue of Lord Eddard in the crypt was prepared, and many nights, Catelyn would go down there to light candles and weep in private. Bran sometimes followed, though he kept to the edges, unsure how to comfort his mother or himself. War raged on, with Robb Stark now proclaimed king in the north by his bannermen. A new chapter had begun in the story of House Stark. Under these heavy burdens, Bran felt his own role shift. He was no longer just the curious boy who climbed walls. He was a Stark of Winterfell with responsibilities. Maester Luwin guided him through daily tasks, hearing small folk petitions, supervising repairs around the castle, and ensuring the winter stores were adequate. There were times Bran felt overwhelmed, but also proud. He was helping keep the North afloat in the absence of Robb, and his father's memory propelled him forward. He seldom climbed anymore, partly out of respect for his mother's wishes, partly because the weight of so many new duties left little room for frivolity. Yet the war pressed on, and with it came dangers. Ironborn raiders, emboldened by the chaos, began to harass the northern coasts. Theon Greyjoy, who had left Winterfell with Robb, became a messenger between Robb and his father, Balon Greyjoy. In a cruel twist, the Greyjoy fleet struck the north, eventually capturing Moat Cailin and other strategic points. Word came that Theon, who had once laughed with the Starks, had taken Winterfell in a sudden, treacherous move. The news spread like wildfire, leaving Bran in a state of shock. Was that truly possible? Theon had grown up among them. Yet the next set of ravens confirmed the betrayal. The Ironborn had arrived, claiming Winterfell in the name of Balon Greyjoy. The memory of that day was seared into Bran's mind. Armed Ironborn men scaled the walls and forced entry, catching the small garrison by surprise. Bran had been in the maester's turret when the first shouts rang out. He raced to the window and saw smoke curling from the courtyard. His heart pounded wildly. By the time he descended the stairs, Theon Greyjoy was standing in the great hall, a reaver's helm under one arm, demanding that Winterfell yield. Bran saw him from a distance and felt rage and confusion swirl. How could Theon do this? They had shared meals, jokes, hunts. Had it all been a lie? But Theon's men outnumbered the small Winterfell guard, and after a few men were killed, it was clear that resistance would only bring more death. Maester Luwin silently urged Bran to step forward and yield to spare lives. Bran did so, trembling with anger he barely knew how to contain. Theon declared himself Prince of Winterfell, demanded the loyalty of all those present, and promised safety if they complied. The Ironborn hoisted their Kraken banners on the battlements. The castle was under their control. Trapped in his own home, Bran experienced a sense of powerlessness unlike anything he had known before. He was no cripple, but he still felt crippled by his inability to change what was happening. Theon's men roamed the corridors with casual cruelty. Reek and Ramsay Snow, names that later became infamous, were rumored to be lurking on the outskirts, though at this point they were not the main threat in Winterfell. Theon insisted on trying to rule with some semblance of order, but he was clumsy at it, unsure whether to be stern or merciful. The Northmen regarded him as a traitor, neither master nor friend. Their resentment simmered behind sullen eyes. For Bran, the days were filled with forced courtesy. He had to wear fine clothes and attend Theon's gatherings in the Great Hall. He was forced to call Theon Prince or My Lord, which turned his stomach. Maester Luwin counseled patience and cunning. Perhaps rescue would come. Robb was king in the north, marching from victory to victory against the Lannisters in the Riverlands. Sooner or later, he would turn his army homeward. Bran tried to keep hope alive, to remain stoic and strong, as he imagined his father would have wished. Yet the injustice of it all, the heartbreak, was almost too much. Then came the day the Bolton forces arrived under the banner of the Flayed Man, offering to help retake Winterfell. At first, Theon and his Ironborn sensed a trap. But negotiations began, and it seemed something might shift in the balance of power. The name Ramsay Snow, Ramsay Bolton's bastard, floated through the corridors like a curse. The man was said to be cunning, ruthless. Some believed he had his own designs. The tension in Winterfell thickened. Bran found himself quietly conferring with Maester Luwin. "If Robb won't be here soon, maybe the Boltons can free us," he whispered one night, though his voice carried a note of fear. The Boltons had never been known for mercy, and their house words were unspoken but well known. "Our blades are sharp. Could such an ally be trusted?" Maester Luwin could not say. "We must act with care, my lord," the Maester cautioned, calling Bran my lord more often these days, as though preparing him for a greater role. A chill wind swept across the land, marking the turn of the season toward a harsher winter. Word arrived that Robb had been fighting in the Westerlands, that he had won notable victories against the Lannisters. Meanwhile, King's Landing reeled under the fractious rule of Joffrey Baratheon, and Stannis Baratheon waged his own campaign for the Iron Throne. The realm was fractured, each corner claiming a new king. In the north, Theon Greyjoy's hold on Winterfell was tenuous at best, a single strong breeze away from collapse. By the time Ramsay Snow's forces actually set foot near the gates, it was clear that some final confrontation was at hand. One late afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the walls, the Bolton banners drew close. Theon scrambled to rally his men, preparing for either a parley or a siege. Bran stood behind one of the arrow slits, heart pounding, watching the Boltons approach. He could feel dread in his bones. Theon's Ironborn were outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Winterfell itself had minimal defenses left after so many men had marched south with Robb. A short skirmish erupted near the main gate, then an eerie quiet. Suddenly the gates opened. Theon walked out, flanked by his men, to speak with Ramsay. Bran couldn't hear the words exchanged, but it looked tense. Then, a signal was given, and Bolton men poured in, capturing Theon's reavers or cutting them down where they stood. It happened so quickly that Theon barely had time to react. Some Ironborn threw down their weapons, begging for mercy. Others died in a hail of arrows. Bran watched with a mixture of relief and horror. Perhaps this was Winterfell's liberation, yet the men doing the liberating were Boltons, known for cruelty that rivaled any. The courtyard ran red with blood, the Ironborns and some of the castle guards as well. Smoke began to rise from unseen corners. Something was amiss when Ramsay Snow, soon to be legitimized as Ramsay Bolton, strode through the gates. The look on his face was not that of a savior. He took in Winterfell's halls as if he claimed them by right, his expression one of perverse glee. Bran's dread deepened. With a few curt orders, Ramsay had Theon bound and dragged away. Screams echoed off the stone walls as some of the Ironborn were tortured. Ramsay's men began ransacking the place, searching for valuables and valuables owners alike. It was clear that Ramsay meant to destroy and desecrate. Maester Luwin hurried Bran to a hidden passageway beneath the castle, hoping to smuggle him out. In the chaos, Rickon became separated, but Hodder, loyal and simple Hodder, found the youngest Stark and carried him. Together, they tried to navigate the labyrinth of tunnels that snaked under Winterfell, once used by the Kings of Winter as secret escape routes. Bits of collapsed stone and disuse made progress slow. Above them, the clash of steel and screams continued. Smoke seeped in, filling the passage with the smell of burning wood. They emerged into the Godswood, the heart of Winterfell. The ancient weirwood tree, its carved face sorrowful, stood sentinel. Flames licked the edges of nearby buildings, and the great keep itself seemed to be catching fire. Winterfell was being razed by the very men who had come to rescue it. Maester Luwin, wounded during the chaos, sank to the ground, urging Bran and Rickon to flee north to find safety. With tears in his eyes, Bran realized there was no time to save his mother's treasured castle. Hodder gently hoisted Rickon onto his back. Osha, who had been a captive wildling turned servant, appeared from behind a burning gate, offering her help. She insisted they must leave immediately. Bran resisted at first, but the urgency in Osha's eyes and the unearthly silence of the gods would made him relent. He knelt by Maester Luwin, tears in his eyes, as the old man whispered his final counsel. Then, with a heavy heart, Bran said goodbye and led the others deeper into the forest, slipping through a small postern gate that led away from the carnage. Behind them, Winterfell burned, and the raucous cries of Bolton men echoed through the night. For a long time, Bran and his companions wandered the north, haunted by the weight of what had happened. They were forced to keep their identities hidden, for fear of Boltons or Ironborn or Lannisters who might capture them. At nights, by the embers of a small campfire, Bran dreamed of returning to Winterfell, of restoring the honor of House Stark. He dreamed of his father, of Robb, of all that had been lost. Sometimes Rickon would cry out in his sleep, and Hodder would try to soothe him. Osha prowled the edges of their camp, always on guard. In the daytime, they moved carefully, traveling small roads or forest paths. In the original turning of the wheel, Bran might have been a cripple, compelled to seek out the three-eyed raven. He might have possessed powerful greenseer abilities that would reshape the destiny of men and others alike. But in this world, he remained a boy of unbroken limbs, though the scars inside him ran deep. He had not been forced to confront life in the same way he otherwise would have, and so his gifts, if they existed, lay dormant. Yet a kernel of that magic still pulsed in his veins. He felt it sometimes in his dreams, a strange sense that the old gods were whispering, beckoning him to the heart of the north beyond the wall. But his rational mind shrugged it off as fear or fancy. Their journey took them through the lonely wilds of the north. They passed abandoned villages, small holdfasts burned or emptied by the war, The husks of houses stood like blackened teeth against the twilight sky. Every now and again, they encountered small folk who recognized something about them. Perhaps the way Bran carried himself, or the direwolf pup that sometimes skulked in the shadows. Yet none betrayed their presence. The small folk of the north, for the most part, were loyal to House Stark. They whispered prayers for the young lord's safety, shared a bit of bread or salt pork, and pointed them northward, always northward. One night, after a particularly long day's travel, Bran dreamed of a monstrous weirwood tree whose red leaves formed a canopy overhead. In the dream, ravens circled, calling his name, and the face in the tree wept tears of blood. He awoke with his heart pounding, a slick of cold sweat on his forehead. Across the dying fire, Osha looked at him with concern. She had heard him moaning in his sleep. Bran brushed it off, but something about the dream clung to him. He felt an inexplicable pull that guided him deeper into the wilderness. Though no longer forced by his paralysis, in this world he still found himself inexorably drawn to the old gods. Whenever they made camp near a god's wood or a solitary heart tree, Bran would linger before it. He would almost see shapes in the grain of the wood, or hear whispers in the rustle of the leaves. Sometimes Rickon would join him, but the younger boy was too frightened by their predicament, too unstable to find solace. Hodder just smiled or repeated his name. Osha cast uneasy glances, as if she suspected that powers beyond her ken were at work. On the edges of the known world, rumors trickled in about White Walkers and Whites in the far north. Some dismissed these tales as old wives' stories. Others insisted the dead had begun to move again, that strange lights were seen beyond the wall. Bran did not know what to believe. His father had always been pragmatic, but also taught him that legends often held a kernel of truth. They pressed on. They crossed the domain of the Umbers, finding it bereft of men, who had marched south to join Robb. The few who remained were too preoccupied to spare more than a few supplies. Yet they recognized Bran's face and let him and Rickon pass. Eventually, they reached the vicinity of the wall, that colossal barrier of ice built to guard against the terrors of the long night. In another version of events, Bran's group might have found themselves here for different reasons, guided by warging dreams and mystical destinies. In this thread of fate, however, they came seeking refuge in news. The Night's Watch was neutral in the wars of the realm, or so it was said. Perhaps here, Bran could find safety, or at least glean word of Robb's struggles or his mother's fate. They approached Castle Black cautiously. The swirling snow and the imposing ramparts of ice made the approach feel surreal. Night's Watch sentries challenged them at spear point. Osha raised her hands in peace, explaining they were refugees from Winterfell. At first, the black-clad brothers were suspicious, but word of House Stark's misfortunes had reached even here. In the end, they allowed the small party inside, if only to keep them from freezing to death. Bran soon learned that Jon Snow, his half-brother, was off ranging beyond the wall, dealing with wildling threats. The news sparked a flicker of hope. Perhaps Jon would know what to do. While waiting at Castle Black, Bran heard more tales. Tales of the king beyond the wall, Mance Rayder, amassing a great host of free folk. Talk of the dead walking, of ancient evils stirring in the heart of winter. He heard of Samwell Tarly, a steward who had encountered mysterious foes in the frozen wastes, of the Lord Commander Mormont's concerns. It seemed that the realm's petty wars might be dwarfed by something far more menacing, creeping toward them from the icy darkness. Night after night, as the wind howled outside the great gate, Bran dreamed of that eerie weirwood face, always crying. Sometimes he saw it with 1,000 ravens perched upon its branches, their eyes glinting like black stars. It called to him, though he did not know how to answer. In time, Castle Black received word that King in the North, Robb Stark, had fallen victim to betrayal at the Twins, a ghastly event soon known as the Red Wedding. Bran heard the news as if in a nightmare, standing in the courtyard among the scattered watchers, with the chill wind biting at his ears. His mother, too, was said to have perished that night. The families of the Riverlands had made peace with the Lannisters in exchange for the destruction of the Stark cause. Walder Frey had orchestrated the slaughter of guests under his roof. The once mighty northern host was scattered, its great lords either captured or killed, or bending the knee to the Iron Throne. There would be no relief army riding to reclaim Winterfell or to rescue Bran and Rickon. The king in the north was gone. Despair, black and suffocating, engulfed Bran. Everything he had known, everything he had hoped for, was unraveling like a poorly woven tapestry. House Stark seemed doomed, its members dead or exiled. The boy who once climbed towers to see the horizon now wondered if the horizon held any future at all. He pulled Rickon close, sensing how fragile his younger brother was in the face of such tragedy. Hodder stood by, mutely patting Rickon's head, a giant's gentleness offering scant comfort. Osha watched them with a solemn expression, perhaps regretting she had tied her fate to such cursed children of the Highborn. It was then that Dolorous Ed Tollett, a brother of the Night's Watch, tentatively approached Bran. "There's someone here to see you," he said, voice low, as if the news was both wondrous and terrible. Bran followed Ed to the small library chamber near the Lord Commander's quarters. There, he found Jon Snow, newly returned from beyond the wall. The half-brother he had not seen in what felt like ages stood before him, wrapped in the black cloak of the Watch, his face etched by hardship and sorrow. Yet for a moment, they might have been two boys back in Winterfell, greeting each other after an absence. Jon's eyes widened at the sight of Bran, grown taller and leaner, yet carrying a weight far beyond his years. They embraced, both on the verge of tears, united by the grief of losing nearly everything dear to them. Jon had heard rumors of Robb's death, of their mother's death, and was grappling with his own heartbreak. The duties of the Watch forbade him from taking sides in the realm's conflicts, but the threat of the White Walkers overshadowed all. Jon told Bran of the horrors beyond the wall, of the armies of the dead, of the looming war for the dawn. In the face of such dire tidings, the struggles of kings and lords seemed almost trivial. Yet blood ties ran deeper than oaths, and Jon could not abandon his brother entirely. He arranged for Bran, Rickon, Osha, and Hodder to stay under the protection of the Watch for a time. However, the Night's Watch had its own precarious position. The realm was fractured, resources were scarce, and Mance Rayder's forces were gathering at their doorstep. The old magic whispered to Bran again in his dreams, telling him that the North was calling to him, that some power in the heart of winter needed his presence, that the old gods demanded a Stark to stand against the coming darkness. Yet, in this timeline, Bran did not fully understand those messages. He had never been thrown from the tower, never awakened to the Greenseer's path. The beckoning was faint, buried under layers of uncertainty. Even so, a small part of him felt that it was time to journey even farther north, beyond the wall, to find something or someone. Jon, torn between his duty and his love for his siblings, wrestled with what to do. He knew that if Bran stayed at Castle Black, it might be safer than wandering in the lands of always winter. But the weight of prophecy and the intangible sense of destiny pressed upon them. Against all reason, Jon arranged for a small band to guide Bran and Rickon north of the wall. Cold Hands, a mysterious figure whispered of in wildling tales, appeared at the fringes of the haunted forest, offering safe passage to some unknown destination. Osha, protective as ever, insisted on coming, though she doubted the wisdom of trusting a shadowy stranger. Hodder simply repeated his name, following wherever Bran led. The younger Stark boy, Rickon, too terrified to be left behind, clung to them with wide eyes. Thus began a grim trek beyond the wall, into a realm of ice and ancient secrets. The days blended into a haze of swirling snow, the nights lit only by the eerie shimmer of the aurora. Bran felt a stirring inside himself, a sense that each step carried him closer to a revelation that might heal or destroy him. The wind's howl sometimes sounded like voices calling his name. Once, he thought he saw a great stag made of shimmering ice on a distant ridge, its antlers stretching toward the sky. Another time, he dreamed of a pack of direwolves racing across a frozen tundra, each with glowing green eyes. None of it made sense to his waking mind, but he pressed on. They traversed icy streams and hidden valleys, avoided roving packs of whites, and encountered wildlings fleeing south. Cold hands guided them by silent gestures and cryptic commands. Osha glared at him suspiciously, but followed nonetheless. At night, they huddled around small fires, telling half-whispered stories of times long past. Bran recounted the legends old Nan used to speak of, the long night, the last hero, the children of the forest. At times, he wondered if he was chasing a children's tale. But one frozen morning, they reached a series of ancient steps carved into a mountainside. A winding path led them to a hidden cave, whose mouth was draped with icy stalactites. Within, the sound of dripping water echoed in the darkness. Cold hands gestured them forward, then vanished, as if his task was done. Bran, fear clawing at his chest, led the way, with Rickon clinging to his side and Hodder following. Osha carried a torch, the flickering flame casting wild shadows on the cave walls. A sense of antiquity pressed upon them, as though the stones themselves breathed with ancient life. Eventually, they emerged into a vast cavern lit by an otherworldly glow. Roots and vines clung to the ceiling, twisting like old bones. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, reminiscent of the children's runes. The air was cold, yet there was a warmth deeper inside, near a cluster of weirwood roots that seemed to pulse faintly. A voice, soft and echoing, spoke out of the gloom, inviting them closer. Though Bran felt terror, he also felt a pull he could not deny. He advanced slowly, step by step. From the shadows emerged a figure with skin like old milk, eyes gleaming red, half embedded in the gnarled trunk of a massive weirwood root system. It was the three-eyed crow, or raven, as some said, an ancient greenseer whose visage was both man and memory. He regarded Bran with knowing eyes. "You have come," the figure rasped, as if he had been waiting 1,000 years for this moment. In another life, Bran might have arrived as a cripple, shaped by tragedy, half-guided by visions. In this life, he was intact in body but still weighed down by loss. The greenseer beckoned him forward, indicating that he had a role yet to play in the war against the darkness. The magic that the old gods had woven through the Stark's bloodline was not extinguished simply because Bran had avoided his fateful fall. It merely took a different course, slower and less certain. Yet here he stood, at the threshold of a power that transcended kings and crowns. Rickon cowered behind Bran, Osha's torch flickering in the cavern's drafts. Hodder stood wide-eyed, repeating his name. Bran swallowed hard, stepping forward until he was close enough to see that the tangled roots were fused with the greenseer's flesh. It was a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying. The figure reached out a skeletal hand, not quite touching Bran but beckoning him closer. "The hour is late," he said in a voice that echoed with centuries of knowledge. "The darkness gathers, and the world of men cannot stand against it alone. The lion and the stag squabble, the kraken rebels, and the flayed man turns on his own. All is chaos, but in chaos, we find the seeds of rebirth." Bran realized, with a clarity that shocked him, that he stood upon the precipice of fate. All he had lost, the father, the brothers, the home, paled in comparison to the cosmic battle that loomed. He could almost see it in the greenseer's eyes, a tide of death rolling south, guided by inhuman forces. The knowledge chilled his soul. If he embraced this power, he might stand against the oncoming storm. If he turned away, the world would face an endless night, unprepared and leaderless. He recalled the days when he had been carefree, climbing towers in Winterfell, believing the worst danger was falling and breaking his neck. If only that had been the greatest threat. He thought of Ned Stark's patient teachings, of Robb's sense of duty, of Catelyn's fierce love. He thought of Arya, Sansa, Jon, each scattered to the winds by the cruelty of fate. A quiet strength rose in him. If he could do something, if he could learn from this ancient greenseer, then he might save not just the North but all the realms of men. He bowed his head. The three-eyed crow, Raven, gestured to a hollow in the roots. "Come, my young Stark," he intoned. "Let me show you what you must see." Bran glanced back at Rickon, who looked on with anxious eyes, and at Osha, whose hand trembled around the torch. In that moment, Bran made his choice. He stepped forward, placing his hands among the tangle of white roots. The greenseer's withered fingers brushed Bran's temples, and suddenly, Bran felt a rush of images and sensations like a river flooding its banks. He saw the ancient past, the first men forging pacts with the children of the forest, the rise of the others in the long night, the forging of the wall. He saw glimpses of the present, scattered across the realm. Dragons in the east, a golden lion in King's Landing, the flayed man in Winterfell's ruins, the red woman praying to a fire god. And he saw the future, a shifting tapestry of possibilities, some blindingly bright, others drenched in blood and ice. Pain lanced through him, but with it came understanding. He was a link in the chain of history, a key to bridging the old magic and the new age. The greenseer's voice echoed in his mind. You have chosen a different path, Bran Stark, yet the threads of fate coil around you still. Shape them, be shaped by them. The hour is at hand. When the torrent of visions subsided, Bran collapsed to his knees, gasping. He felt as though he had lived 1,000 lifetimes in the span of a single breath. Around him, the cavern was unchanged, silent except for Rickon's worried whimper and the drip of water from stalactites. The three-eyed raven was immobile, still fused with the roots, watching him with patient expectation. Bran looked at his hands, unbroken and strong. He had come so far without that fateful fall from the tower that had, in another world, catalyzed his journey into these depths. Yet destiny had a way of seeking out those it needed, whether through cruel accidents or crueler wars. His old life, the boy who dreamed of knights and soared along Winterfell's battlements, was over. In its place was the mantle of an heir to the ancient powers of the North. And with that mantle came a burden heavier than any lordship, the duty to stand against an unimaginable darkness. He turned to his companions. Rickon stared at him, tears brimming. Osha still looked wary, as though half expecting some monster to spring forth from the shadows. Hodder mumbled, "Hodder," rocking back and forth. Bran forced a weak smile. Despite all that had happened, they were his family now, all that remained of the once proud house Stark in this frozen corner of the world. The knowledge he had gained pressed at the edges of his thoughts like an onrushing tide. He would need time to sift through it, to glean the truth from the visions. But one thing he knew for sure. His path lay forward, deeper into the mysteries of the old gods, where he could learn to use the gifts hidden in his blood. The greenseer's voice broke the silence. Rest now, boy, for tomorrow you learn what it means to walk in other skins, to see with other eyes. There is little time to waste. The dead come for us all. Outside the cave, the wind howled, and snow drifted against the rocky slopes. The swirl of war in the south continued, with kings and queens battling for thrones and crowns that might soon be meaningless if the long night fell once more. Winterfell lay in ruins, its rightful rulers scattered to the winds. But in the hidden corners of the north, the ancient magic stirred, waiting for a Stark to rekindle its flame. Bran Stark, whole of body but scarred of spirit, knelt in the glow of the weirwood roots, preparing to reshape his destiny and the destiny of the world. It might not have happened this way had he fallen from that tower long ago. That crippling event had once been the catalyst for his awakening. But even without the fall, fate had led him here, through tragedy upon tragedy, forging him in the crucible of war and loss. The old gods had not abandoned him. The realms of men still needed a guardian of memory, someone to stand against the coming dark. In this moment, in the heart of the frozen wilderness, Bran understood that every road, no matter how twisted, can lead to the same destiny if the powers that shape the world will it so. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, letting the echoes of the weirwood's song envelop him. The three-eyed crow began to chant in a low, rasping tone that resonated through the cavern. Roots rustled like living things, brushing Bran's arms and legs as if welcoming him into their embrace. Slowly, a vision of Winterfell rose in his mind, not as it was now, broken and burned, but as it had been, strong and proud. He saw the courtyard where he had shot arrows and sparred with wooden swords. He saw the towers he had climbed, the vantage points that once brought him such freedom. A bittersweet pang shot through his heart. That Winterfell was gone, at least for now. But he vowed that, if he could, he would bring its memory back to life, restoring it for Rickon, for Sansa, for Arya, for Jon, for all of them who had once called it home. For that to happen, the darkness must be met head-on. He felt the power stirring in his blood, flickering like a candle against the wind. It was knowledge, it was sight, it was the age-old bond between the Starks and the land they had ruled for generations. The North was more than ice and cold. It was willpower, resilience, and the silent strength of ancient kings. If Bran could harness that, perhaps there was hope yet. When the chanting ceased, the Green Seer fixed him with a final, measured gaze. You cannot undo the wheel of history, Bran Stark, but you can alter its course. Learn from me. Learn from the trees, from the ravens, from the very stones beneath the snow. Walk the path that was always meant for you, though it came by a different road. Bran, weary beyond measure, nodded and settled on the cold cave floor. Rickon curled up beside him, drawing warmth from his older brother's body. Hodder hovered protectively, and Osha kept the torch at a distance, as if not wanting to disturb the living roots with flame. For a long while, Bran simply breathed, letting the swirl of images and revelations slowly recede to a place within him where he could process them. There would be no restful sleep tonight, but maybe a measure of acceptance, of purpose. House Stark had endured centuries of winter, and it would endure this one, somehow. In the following days, lessons began in earnest. The Green Seer taught Bran how to slip into the skin of animals, to see through their eyes, feel the power in their muscles. Bran discovered that his bond with Summer, his direwolf, was strong even at a distance, that he could call on his companion for aid or counsel in dreams. He practiced scrying into the Weirwood network, glimpsing fragments of the past, from the forging of the wall to his own ancestors kneeling in the God's Wood of Winterfell. Each vision left him exhausted but more attuned to the rhythms of the ancient magic. Rickon, too young to fully grasp these events, watched with a mixture of awe and fear. Osha stood guard, uncertain if all this was unnatural. Hodder remained a comforting presence, gentle and reliable despite the strangeness around them. Meanwhile, outside the cave, the realm's wars raged on. The Boltons claimed the North for themselves, forging alliances with the Lannisters. The iron grip of the Iron Throne tightened around the Seven Kingdoms, crushing any who resisted. Yet the threat of the White Walkers grew ever more tangible, sightings multiplying among the scattered wildlings. Winter's winds blew stronger, biting with the promise of a colder tomorrow. In the hush of the cavern, Bran learned that sometimes the greatest battles happen not on fields of steel, but in the quiet places where minds touch the roots of the world. His heartbreak and loss formed the foundation of his resolve. He had not asked for these gifts or this burden. He had not asked for a life shaped by war and betrayal. But he was a Stark, and Starks faced what came. Whether he was broken of body or whole, that fundamental truth did not change. Time slipped by. The small band huddled together for warmth, forging a new sense of family. The cave became both school and sanctuary. The three-eyed crow, ancient and patient, guided Bran deeper into visions of the White Walkers, glimpses of their creation at the hands of the children of the forest, of the fierce battles that had once driven them back. Bran saw the mistakes of men repeated across ages, the lust for power, the ignorance of looming peril. He wondered if the realm could unite in time to stand against the horror that approached. And in fleeting moments of doubt, he questioned if his presence here could truly make a difference. Yet each lesson, each vision, hardened his determination. He might not sit on the Iron Throne, nor lead a grand host in battle like Robb had, but he would be the watcher on the threshold, guarding knowledge that could tip the balance between life and death. He would hold the memory of the world so that the living might have a chance to survive the night. No matter that he had not fallen from that tower long ago. No matter that his path was shaped by war instead of personal tragedy. The end was the same. Bran Stark, deep in the far north, forging himself into the realm's last, best hope against the ancient enemy. And as he knelt before the Weirwood roots, letting them envelop him in a living tapestry older than kingdoms. He felt the faintest stirrings of hope. The old gods had not abandoned the north. The old magic was not dead. And perhaps, in its own subtle way, fate was weaving a tapestry that might yet end in dawn, rather than in eternal night. In that hidden cave, Bran embraced the mantle of the Green Seer, resolved to use the powers of sight and warging for the good of all. The three-eyed crow faded into a quiet presence, guiding from within the weirwood's embrace. Rickon clutched his brother's hand, too afraid to let go, while Hodder murmured his name, ready to carry them both if need be. Osha watched from the periphery, uneasy but loyal. The hours stretched into days, the days into weeks. The wind outside roared like a hungry beast, and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Far away, the lords and ladies of Westeros fought for crowns, spilled blood for banners, and whispered of alliances and betrayals. They had forgotten the real war, the ancient war, the one that would decide the fate of every child in every corner of the land. But in that secret hollow beneath the earth, a boy not yet a man glimpsed the tapestry of time and took up the role he was born for, even if he had never been pushed from a tower's ledge. For Bran Stark was, and would always be, more than just a child of Winterfell. He was the living link between past and future, the quiet sentinel in the darkness. And though his journey had followed a different road, destiny's call rang clear, echoing through the roots of the weirwoods and the silent halls of memory. When the snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. He would do everything in his power to ensure that truth yet held meaning in a world on the brink of the longest night.